Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today at our first video briefing in 2022. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today. And of course, I want to welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. If you don't yet support our work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. Now on to today's briefing. On Friday, extremist settlers attacked Palestinians and Israeli activists, injuring at least 6 in the West Bank town of Burin near Nablus. And just yesterday, a convoy of Israeli settlers drove through the West Bank town of Hawara and reportedly injured 3 Palestinians. These incidents are part of a disturbing trend of Jewish settlers committing violent attacks in the West Bank against Palestinians, Israeli civilians, and IDF soldiers. Such actions increased dramatically in 2021 compared to 2020. Palestinian attacks against Israelis in the West Bank are on the rise as well. I am proud that Israel Policy Forum spearheaded an effort involving several mainstream American Jewish organizations to deliver a letter of concern about developments to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Defense Minister Benny Gantz, and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. I want to express our organization's appreciation to our partners on that letter: the ADL, the Union for Reform Judaism, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Rabbinical Assembly, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and the National Council of Jewish Women. We will share the full text of the letter in the chat, and you can also find it on our website, israelpolicyforum.org. I think it's important to note that there have been important statements made by Foreign Minister Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz in recent days. Of course, this violence should be condemned by all, and those responsible held accountable. These disturbing attacks must be addressed with the seriousness that this issue deserves. Today, we are joined by Jacob Magid of the Times of Israel to unpack the troubling trend of rising violence by Jewish extremists and its impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations, interethnic tensions, and West Bank security. Jacob is now the U.S. correspondent at the Times of Israel. But in recent years, he has reported from the West Bank, including covering the violence in the central Northwest Bank region where these most recent incidents have taken place. As always, we welcome your questions. Please type them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later on our website at israelpolicyforum.org/briefings. With that, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us. For starters, please provide us with an overview of this trend and how it has been exacerbated over the past year. What types of violence committed by Israeli Jews in the West Bank are on the rise? Who is perpetrating these attacks, and what is their goal?
Yep, so thank you very much for having me. I was covering this issue for about 4 years, and Israel Policy Forum, even from abroad, was kind of always had a great pulse on what was happening, and you guys provide an incredible resource, so thank you for the work that you guys are doing. So an overview, some statistics. In 2020, the Shin Bet documented 272 incidents of what they called violence perpetrated by Jewish extremists. And then the next year in 2021, we saw the agency record 397 such incidents, so a significant rise. And what we're talking about is basically vandalism of, for the most part, is vandalism of property belonging to Palestinians. We're seeing slashing of tires of parked cars, uprooting of or burning down of even olive trees, graffitiing slogans about Jewish supremacy on buildings, but also rocks being thrown through car windows and homes, Molotov cocktails and stun grenades being thrown through cars and homes, and several mosque torchings as well. Then it escalates to physical assaults like we saw yesterday, sometimes against Israeli activists as well as Palestinians, and then attacks also on IDF personnel and their equipment, particularly those in the northern West Bank guarding the settlement of Yitzhar and the surrounding outposts that we've been seeing spike in recent years. Now, for the most part, these attacks are carried out by Israeli teens, often referred to as Hilltop youth, who are known for their living in the illegal outposts throughout the West Bank. These are wildcat compounds of only a handful of buildings on some abandoned mountaintop. And the attacks are, particularly those on property, are often referred to as price tag, meaning that they're meant to demonstrate that there's a price for action taken against the settlement movement, be it a terror attack or the demolition of illegal homes by Israeli security forces. You'll notice that whether these acts are perpetrated by Palestinians or not, they're the ones to pay in these quote unquote price tag attacks. Now, the term price tag is actually used by the assailants themselves. Sometimes it'll even be graffitied on the property that they're vandalizing. And they're trying to make this connection between their actions and those actions taken against them. But I would be cautious to make such a connection too directly, meaning that these are lawless kids, often high school and middle school dropouts, and often living in a lawless area, who are carrying out these acts simply because they can. They're motivated by this extremist Jewish supremacy ideology that doesn't require an act on Jews to justify taking such actions, because all the land belongs to them and that non-Jews need to be basically driven out of the territory. At least that's the most extremist of the ideologies. Now, there's no shortage of rabbis that give these Hilltop youth backing, obviously definitely extremist ones, and they're not in the mainstream, and they are well know that this violence is being carried out, but I think it's seen as part of an overall goal of populating as much of the land as possible, and these kids are used as a tool to do so. Why else are they motivated? I would say because, at least partially, if not indirectly, it's because there's little fear from the authorities. Not only because they don't always recognize the legitimacy of these authorities, but also because Israeli police are so ineffective in bringing anyone to justice. 91% of all police investigations into attacks by Israelis on Palestinians between the years 2005 and 2019 were closed without any indictments. And an even higher percentage is closed without any conviction. Now, the last thing I'll add is that human rights groups and settlement watchdogs and many Palestinians consider this violence to be a feature rather than a bug of Israeli rule in the West Bank, meaning that it's a critical part of the effort to ensure Jewish presence in the West Bank at the expense of Palestinians. Now, it's also worth stressing that these attackers make up only a few hundred youth, if not less, and that these actions do not receive overt backing from other settlers or the leadership. At the same time, the leadership has done little to clamp down on the phenomenon. Condemnations are exceedingly rare unless the violence is particularly graphic or against soldiers or Palestinians or Israelis as opposed to Palestinians. Moreover, the municipal heads kind of argue that it's not really their responsibility. These are kids often coming from places that are not from the West Bank. They're not their residents, and then they're finding themselves on these outposts and wreaking havoc. Now, some mayors are acting, and in Beit El, for example, there's a school that I wrote about a couple of years ago where they specifically cater to these types of at-risk youth, and they've had a lot of success in getting them to take and pass the high school matriculation exam to give them some sort of future. But these schools are few and far between in the West Bank, and they lack the necessary funding to operate at a larger scale. So this phenomenon continues.
Well, thank you for sort of laying the foundation for what we'll be talking about, Jacob. Recently, we've also witnessed a rise in Palestinian terrorist attacks targeting Jews in the West Bank, with shootings and stabbings doubling from 2020 to 2021. How are these trends related, and what is driving them?
Okay, so again, I would say the price tag title these attacks are given might lead onlookers to see a direct connection between the two of Palestinian violence and Israeli violence, which I would be hesitant to make because specifically when looking at settler violence, is what we're talking about today, and we could have a much broader conversation about Palestinian violence, which is A, more violent, and B, more prevalent. Particularly property vandalism, though, is occurring regularly throughout the West Bank, particularly when I was there from 2017 to 2020, happening very frequently. And much of those periods were featured relatively quiet periods on the ground. Now, of course, there's a general connection, and Israeli security officials you'll speak with during times of peaking settler violence are quick to express this fear that it might lead to a retaliatory attack, and they're very sure to leak these concerns to the media at those specific periods. Beyond that, I would say the broader drivers of Palestinian violence also probably depend on who you talk to. The left will maybe say it has to do with occupation, while the right will say it has to do with incitement in the Palestinian arena and an ideology of hate. Those in the middle probably say it's a little bit of both. We should also be clear that the attacks on Israelis, again, happen more frequently, and including in the recent days, and are much more violent against Israelis. I mean, we're talking about murders that are at a much higher scale, relatively. On the other hand, Israeli military control over Palestinians is a 24/7 phenomenon, right? And that they have to endure constantly, and obviously impacts every facet of their lives, in some areas less than others. But obviously there's two sides to the story.
There are reports of IDF inaction in the face of settler attacks against Palestinians and simultaneously clashes between IDF soldiers and extremist settlers. What does the IDF's involvement on this issue look like?
So it's tricky, I would say. I think because soldiers are there first and foremost to protect Israeli civilians. I think there's this misunderstanding out there that soldiers are not allowed to use force against Israeli civilians who are in the middle of carrying out an attack. It's true that Israeli police are responsible for dealing with Israeli civilians, not the soldiers, and that the police are the ones that are supposed to carry out arrests. But soldiers are allowed to and are told that they should apprehend attackers if they see something happening. The footage from these attacks of troops standing by and watching shows that these apprehensions are exceedingly rare. Again, it's tricky because I think that these soldiers might even A, live in the West Bank, but B, they're spending time there with these communities on a daily basis guarding them. And they don't necessarily want to turn on these kids or their communities when they're still going at the end of the day to be providing them protection just hours later. And that's the complexity, I would say, of this entire civilian soldier dynamic in the West Bank that really places soldiers in a near impossible situation. Now, even if they're just dispatched to the scene for a particular event and they're not there guarding 24/7, at the end of the day, these are 18 to 20-year-olds being asked to take action against fellow Israelis in defense of Palestinians. And there's all sorts of peer pressures involved, and then it leads to scenes that we've become accustomed to of soldiers kind of just watching as these attacks are taking place.
I just want to add what we saw last week in Burin. They're also attacking Israeli civilians.
Right.
It's Israeli on Israeli violence as well as Israeli and Palestinian violence. So where's the IDF in that?
Right. I would say actually just on that note, when you talk to some of the settler leaders, maybe less so, but those who are closer in ideology to those carrying out these attacks, I think there's more disdain for the Israelis that the rights groups like Yesh Din or B'Tselem or folks of that nature who are trying to assist the Palestinians, who speak out against settler violence. There's more disdain for them than for the Palestinians themselves. And that, I think, is why it might not have been too surprising to see the attack that took place. And even if you spoke to a couple of security officials afterwards, it was believed to have been planned, the attack on Friday. They know when these groups are coming to assist the Palestinians, and they chose that time specifically. Again, as in terms of where the soldiers are when those actions are taking place, it's the same very difficult scenario where at the end of the day, these Israelis are there to help Palestinians, and this is not it's not the main role of the IDF to be wanting to protect them, and B, they're just in an awkward situation where, as much as they are against violence, I think it puts them in a more difficult situation when those perpetrating it are Jews.
As you know, many right-wing politicians in Israel, both in the government and in the opposition, have decried the use of the term settler violence. Public Security Minister Omar Assad came under significant criticism for using the term. How is this issue playing out in the Israeli political discourse?
Right. So Omar Assad, the public security minister who's in charge of the police, came under significant criticism, right, for using the term. And he used it, he called it settler violence in a tweet that he posted after he held a meeting with Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who was visiting Israel last month. He said that they spoke about a number of issues, including settler violence. This caused the political right to erupt in criticism because why are you airing out our dirty laundry? Settler violence isn't a thing. We're talking about a few extremists that aren't representative, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Bar-Lev stood his ground and received some backing from other left-leaning folks in the government while being blasted by others, including Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett. But the discourse once again became about how you characterize the violence as opposed to the violence itself and how to prevent it. And we saw this play out when Deputy Minister of Economy Yair Golan, who's in Meretz, the left-wing party, called the settlers of Homesh shortly after they endured a deadly terror attack. They called them subhuman. Now, the Homesh is an outpost that initially was a settlement that was evacuated as part of the Gaza disengagement in 2005. And the IDF has allowed a yeshiva to operate there for 15 years on a daily basis, despite the land being determined to belong to Palestinians, despite courts ordering the IDF and Israel to allow Palestinians to work that land. These settlers have been operating this yeshiva there. So Golan, after the attack on them, in which one was killed, calls them subhuman, and sparking uproar across the political spectrum. He first apologized, then he walked it back. He walked his apology back, basically saying that there's no other word to describe them. But the national discussion once again became about how to characterize those living in these outposts, as opposed to whether the outposts should be there in the first place, despite the outposts under Israeli law being illegal. And I think this is a feature of the government that we've come to slowly notice, which is so politically divided that it can get little done on these kinds of key issues, that there is no consensus. So members are reserved to making sometimes bombastic statements that play to their respective bases, particularly in this issue. And those bases I don't think are necessarily just in Israel. Many of these condemnations of settler violence we're seeing are being written in English, and only in English. Some, for example, by Yair Lapid, who interviewed in The Atlantic and talked about it as a stain on Israel's moral record. And that was a pretty big interview that was played up, and they were very careful to get it placed in The Atlantic, and speaking with folks in the office. But there's an understanding of this issue is very concerning to the Biden administration in particular, and members of this government, at least on the center and left, want to demonstrate that they're taking it seriously. Action, on the other hand, I would say is more difficult. There's a lot of political cover for lawmakers. There's not a lot of political cover, I would say, for lawmakers who take up this issue. See what happened to Omar Assad. Bennett, the prime minister, has characterized the phenomenon as insignificant or marginal, depending on how you want to translate the word. And I think it is seen as such by large swaths of the public who are more naturally inclined to focus on issues that have a more direct impact on their lives, like COVID or the economy.
I do want to remind our members of our audience, please, if you have a question, type it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. But I have a few more. So Jacob, earlier this week, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid met with PA Civil Affairs Minister Hussein al-Sheikh, the latest of a series of meetings between high-level Israeli and Palestinian officials that implies deepening coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Is combating settler violence an issue on which Israel and the PA are cooperating? And how is this otherwise affecting Israel-PA ties?
Yeah, so I know this issue is a key one that's brought up by Palestinian officials in their meetings with Israeli officials, and Israel's inability to crack down on it is a cause for a significant barrier of trust between them and the Palestinians, just as Palestinian violence is cause a trust barrier for Israelis. This is an issue that the PA is correct to raise, and that consistent polling of Palestinians, including from noted pollster Khalil Shakaki, shows that there's truly fear on a daily basis that Palestinians note as a result of settler violence. Now, it's somewhat difficult for Palestinian security forces on both sides to cooperate on these issues because most of them are happening in Area C, where Palestinian security forces don't really operate. So there have been incidents in Area A where Israelis have entered the area, we've seen in recent years, and then they're spotted and swarmed by Palestinian mobs before being rescued by Palestinian security forces. Now, in a number of those incidences, there's been assumptions that those Israelis were there to kind of carry out attacks, price tag attacks. So you could say that there's the cooperation that you're referring to, but overall, again, we're looking more likely at places that are where the Palestinian security forces can enter. The difference now that we see, though, in terms of Israeli officials, is that you have some that are willing to acknowledge the phenomenon, as opposed to previous defense ministers who are kind of, it's under their purview. We've had before Gantz, there was Bennett and Lieberman and Netanyahu, three right-wing officials. Lieberman and Bennett may be part of the government, but they're not ones right now to be talking about this issue. Now you have Gantz, who at least is talking about it, and Lapid as well, but they also subscribe to the belief that it's a bug and not a feature of the system, and they refuse to refer to it as settler violence. But again, they're still willing to at least speak about tackling the issue. Eventually, though, I would say that both sides are going to have to produce some actual results in clamping down on violence in their respective communities in order to make progress towards some sort of peaceful solution.
How do you expect the trend of settler violence to develop in 2022? What impact will it have on West Bank security and other aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And what can the government do to curb settler violence and hold the perpetrators accountable? And is it prepared to take the necessary steps to do so? I mean, I think you already addressed that somewhat, but there is this large question. We are at the beginning of 2022 and the trends are not particularly good right now. And you outlined the difference between 2020 and 2021 in terms of a major uptick in settler violence, just what you're reporting at the beginning about the rise in incidents. So this is not something that's going to go away unless something is done to actively confront it, I think.
Right. So as you hinted, I mean, I'm kind of skeptical about whether the government really will be able to clamp down on the phenomenon. Gantz has talked recently about meetings he's held with security forces to strengthen those in charge of dealing with settler violence. But that's kind of been a talking point we've been hearing for several months now. Of course, these things take time, but there hasn't been yet results on the ground. Ultimately, again, it's the police who are in charge of this. And I'm not sure if you've been following recently, this is not a body of law enforcement that has a lot of public trust right now. See the NSO scandal, and I guess we knew that it was being sold to regimes or allegedly sold to regimes to use to crack down on dissidents. There's the Khashoggi story. There's then stories about it being used on Palestinians. So I don't know how surprising it is that it's now being used or reportedly used against Israeli civilians as well. But I think it was noteworthy that when the Shin Bet released its statistics on settler violence last month, they leaked their own figures. The police then leaked their own figures to several outlets that actually showed a significant decline in the number of attacks and significantly fewer than the amount that the Shin Bet posted. Now, I think this can be explained by the fact that the police are really the ones in charge, and they don't want to be seen as incapable of dealing with it, and they want to prove that they're bringing results. Whereas the Shin Bet, which provides more of a supporting role, and the broader security establishment as well, they fear that the settler violence bleeds into the fields that they're responsible for and makes it more difficult to do their work. They're more interested in raising alarm on this issue, so it actually gets addressed, and hence they're different figures, you could argue, from the police. Now, to be fair to the police, I would say that this is a very difficult job to undertake. The vast majority of settlers are, of course, law-abiding, but they're living in this atmosphere that is fundamentally not. So to get to their homes, they're driving through the anarchy of dangerous West Bank roads. And if you've ever been on them, it's not the most comfortable driving experience. And then they arrive in their communities, many of which were built illegally to some degree, because that's how many of the settlement movements have been able to grow, or the settlements have been able to grow. So that's the atmosphere in which it's very difficult to uphold the rule of law, I would say. It's not to say the police don't have the tools to do so. And we saw that the NSO scandal, I think they do have tools to crack down and bring these perpetrators to justice, but there's clearly little willpower, and they'd rather use whatever willpower they do have to clamp down on crime in other sectors where the political benefits are more clear. So has there been an improvement in the government's response? Rhetorically, absolutely. Will that rise to action as well? In some ways, I do believe yes, but it's likely going to be a slow process with steps forward as well as steps back.
I have one more question before I turn to audience questions. And I think you may have answered this in a way previously, but I just wanted to ask about Israeli public opinion on this. I mean, you did say, Jacob, earlier that the Israeli activists who are going to Palestinian villages to either help them to plant trees that have been cut down or burnt by settlers, or to help them with their olive harvest, which of course is an important part of the economy for many Palestinians who own land in the West Bank. You indicated that generally these activists are looked on not so favorably, but there still is this phenomenon of violence perpetrated by Israeli citizens against other citizens. And I'm just wondering if you're seeing anything in the public sphere, any kind of pushback on this violence, because it obviously could spiral out of control, and violence begets violence unless there's something done about it. So are you seeing anything at all that Israelis are reacting to this and are showing concern?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, Israelis are more likely to naturally, like any other country, are more likely to act when those being targeted are their own. And the strongest example of this is when these attacks are against security forces, particularly those operating in Yitzhar, the settlement in northern West Bank, that have seen attacks to their convoys and soldiers as well throughout the years. Those are the ones that open up sometimes the 8 p.m. broadcasts. And there is a lot of public, I think somewhat public uproar from those who see these attacks take place. And I think anyone across the board will say that they're totally disgusting, including settler leaders, and they condemn them. But a broader public uproar taking to the, I mean, definitely not taking to the streets, but I mean, just especially when other things are happening right now that are taking up the concern of the civilians. I don't think this issue is up there in terms of what the people are focusing on, specifically when you talk about the fact that it's civilians that, I mean, and not soldiers that are, when they're being targeted. Again, I think there's an increase in public concern compared to other attacks on property or Palestinians. But still, these are very marginalized activists in the public sphere in general. There have been various efforts to keep them marginalized for a while, and I think this is just a part of it, is not reacting as strongly because of the political ideology of those that are being attacked. Could that change in the coming? I think this government is an example for these kinds of trends to change, but it's, I think, too early to say.
I have a follow-up of sorts from one of our audience members, Julian Lederman. Hi, Julian. Julian is a former IPF New York chair, and he writes, he made Aliyah, so he writes, I live in Israel. It seems amongst the public, there is little action suggesting common people actually care about condemning this. What do you think this suggests about the public's seemingly apathetic disposition to this conflict, as Israeli actions go closer and closer to dangerous steps, raising big questions about how Israelis view right and wrong, justice and injustice?
It's a pretty philosophical question. I'll try to answer it, even though I'm quite out of my field. I would say I think it's a reality of conflict that's gone on for so many years, not just since 67, but 48 and before. You're likely to be desensitized to these kinds of actions, especially when the actions taken by the other side are more violent. There's this automatic effort to kind of compare and say that this is not as bad, even though it's taking place in a broader context of military rule. But yeah, I think that just the reality of the conflict on any people, this is kind of what you might expect after a while of time.
So we have a question from Nancy Kaplan. From what I've read, the vast majority of these attacks are coming from a very few number of settlements, Yitzhar, Beit Ain, Beit El, and illegal wildcat outposts that are notorious for violent behavior. Why isn't the Israeli government pointing this out and targeting the relatively limited sources of the violence? Can't they triangulate and coordinate a law enforcement approach in cooperation with the Yesha Council and other grown-ups in the settler community? And I would just add to Nancy's question, you might want to comment on, I believe the Yesha Council came out with a statement condemning this violence. So that is also, I think, of note.
Yeah, it was pretty rare to see. They were very quick once the video came out on Friday of the car being torched belonging to the Israeli activists. They were quick to condemn the action. But again, I would say it's very rare. I think they are in a difficult situation because they don't want to be seen as aligning with the political left in any way that takes this issue more seriously. Again, they're very adamant that this is a bug, not a feature of the settler movement, that these are a few extremists, and that they very much believe that the way it's being covered in the media is unfair and stresses way too much Israeli violence while ignoring Palestinian violence. That's the way they see it. So there's always going to be that hesitance to kind of do anything more to condemn, let alone do anything more than that. in terms of why can't the police do more, I tried to answer that, but I think they do have the tools. They're in a difficult environment because it's the West Bank, where just a lot of the time anything kind of goes. But do they have the tools to do so? Absolutely. Do they have the political bandwidth to deal with it? I think that's more questionable. I don't think they want to be seen as the one issue that they finally are cracking down with, when they're not really able to crack down on Arab crime, when they're not able to crack down on various other issues. Binary options is something that the Times of Israel's been reporting on, various other forms of crime that's taking place in Israel. That this is going to be the one that they're going to put their minds together and work together on, I'm doubtful.
You partly answered this next question from Jason Berkovich, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think there's some layers that you didn't address. Are Palestinian Authority security forces allowed to arrest settlers in the West Bank? I mean, you talked about Area C, where the IDF has control. Have there been instances where Palestinian security forces attempted to intervene in defense of Palestinians under attack?
So I'm not aware of any specific incidents where there was literally attack taking place and the Palestinian security forces were there to put a stop to it. There have been a number of specific cases where an Israeli civilian has been kind of detained, but it's always just kind of passed on to Israeli security forces by the Palestinian security forces. So this is a little bit out of my purview. I don't know of anyone that specific happened. Again, because of that, they're mainly taking place in Area C, or just taking place in the dead of night when Palestinian security forces might not be able to get there in time. A lot of these attacks, we see them take place on video security CCTV footage the next day, or the Palestinian farmers are waking up to find their crops uprooted. It's always a few hours later when they get to the scene oftentimes.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up to that, because of course there is security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. I mean, the IDF and the Shin Bet, et cetera. But it's essential to the security of both peoples, right? I mean, the security cooperation, there's a lot of anti-Israeli terrorism that is stopped because of the security cooperation. So I'm just wondering how is all this playing out? I mean, as we know, last year we saw a lot of tensions as far as that security cooperation. And if I'm not mistaken, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, Abu Mazen as he's known, for a while was really tamping down on that security cooperation as an act of protest. But I can only imagine this has got to be having an effect as well. If
100%.
If PA is not able to go into Area C and then these acts of violence are being perpetrated and the IDF is not responding, I mean, where does that leave us?
Right. I think the security cooperation is mainly focused, or like what the Palestinians are able to do is, the security forces is kind of deal with Palestinian suspects, and the Israeli security establishment credits them immensely for clamping down on terror that's targeting Israeli civilians, and the Abbas's forces play a critical role. Now, morale amongst those soldiers, or those officers, is definitely shot when events like settler attacks happen. But again, what the Palestinian security forces are kind of able to do in these specific incidents is much more limited than compared to attacks that are on the other side.
So we have a question from Jeff Lefkowitz. Ayelet Shaked has attacked, she's the
Interior Minister.
Interior Minister now, yeah. Interior Minister has attacked those in the government who have criticized the extremist attacks. Are those her true views? And is she an obstacle to cracking down on these guys?
Are those her true views? You might have to ask her. I do think she's very, very, very politically savvy. Having interviewed her quite a few times, she's very careful in how she phrases any sort of message that has to do with the political right in Israel. I think this is someone that very much, this is not her plan to be in this government long term, or for this government. I don't think she might bring it down at this point, but this isn't her dream government. She would much rather more naturally fit in the right-wing government, and she has good ties, or used to have very good ties with Bezalel Smotrich, but still has very good ties with Itamar Ben-Gvir, or relatively good ties with Itamar Ben-Gvir compared, despite the split in their parties. That we're talking about the Religious Zionism Party, which she used to run with as the head of Yamina in one of the past 4 elections. So she's got a lot of roots in that community, despite having a secular background. I think that's where a lot of her, or where she hopes her base is, depending on how much of it is left after her decision to join the government. But basically, that is where, I mean, her ideology is very hardcore right wing. She comes from a Likud background, an Etzel background, and in terms of her ideology, and so it's very hard for her to kind of make statements in any way criticizing the settler movement, which she hopes will one day return to supporting her.
Our next question comes from Doug Mitchell, who asks, what are the possible policy options for the Biden administration to oppose settler violence? You referred to the conversation with Victoria Nuland, but is there more that you think the Biden administration can or should be doing even behind the scenes to indicate that this is an area of great concern?
Behind the scenes, they are doing that. In every single conversation, just about that, if it's Hadi Amar, the Assistant Secretary for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs, if it's Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, all these folks are bringing up settler violence in their conversation, just about all their conversations with Israeli officials. There have been some that have leaked after, Israeli officials that have leaked afterwards, that they're like shocked why this issue or settlement building in general is getting so much attention, thinking that it's an issue, but not the issue as they feel like the Biden administration sees it. So in terms of what other policy options, I think it's just going to be about bringing it up. But I think Israeli officials have noticed that the Biden administration on this issue doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with it. It's not a priority like other issues are. So the extent to which they're going to have to deal with it is just criticism, public criticism that they don't want to see, and that they do respond to. I think we've seen that responding to public criticism on Sheikh Jarrah evictions, or not all of them, but on on Gibat Matos and E1, where there haven't been really significant steps toward expanding in those sensitive areas beyond the Green Line, where they have responded to Biden criticism. But beyond that, I think at the end of the day, they still did advance 3,000 settlement units in the most recent defense ministry meeting a few months ago, and that's on par with what they were approving under the Trump administration. So there's a balancing act that they're playing. They recognize they got to keep the Biden administration on their good side, but they still recognize that the extent of the pushback is just verbal.
Shlomi Peril asks, is an increasing part of the IDF made up of West Bank settlers? If so, does this influence the conduct of the IDF on the West Bank?
Can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
Sure. Is an increasing part of the IDF made up of West Bank settlers? And if so, does this influence the conduct of the IDF on the West Bank?
Okay, so I wouldn't say there's an increasing rate of settlers serving in the IDF. I think it's just there's a slightly larger growth in the settlements as opposed to other places. What we have seen is in recent decades is a significant increase in the amount of religious nationalists, or from the Dati Leumi sector, the National Religious Camp in Israel, becoming officers and very high-ranking officers in the IDF. And we'll continue to see that trend. Does that impact? I mean, naturally, that's the settler movement is seen as like the ideological hub of the National Religious Camp, but that's obviously not even the majority of National Religious Jews that are living in the Green Line. But yes, they're more likely to have nationalist views, of course, and then probably more right-leaning ones as well. But the camp kind of spans pretty broadly throughout the political spectrum, from center to right.
Eva Seligman Kennard asks, how much of this violence is being reported in Israeli media, including on TV? And also, how is this being covered in the Israeli media? What is the conversation looking like among Israelis on social media?
Right. So I would say that some of these attacks have gotten quite a bit of coverage in Israeli media, particularly the Channel 12 and Channel 13. The reporters that kind of focus on this do make sure to publicize these issues and broadcast these issues pretty widely, even at the beginning of a broadcast when there's lots of other news going on. And yes, Israelis do tend to listen to or watch a lot of TV news. But that has also led to pushback, I would say, I think, from politicians and a lot of the Israeli right, who feel like the media is not representative and think that this issue is being overly played up. And that's led to the creation of other news broadcasts that like Channel 20 that now is Channel 14, which is kind of like the poor man's Fox News of Israel. Definitely not as high quality, I would say. That very much is broadcasting a very different narrative that talks about what these Israeli activists that are being attacked, they're called anarchists. I mean, that's the phrase that's always used in the settlements to describe them in general. And that's the narrative that you'll see on that kind of channel.
We have a question from Ari Engel. Could you please speak more about the Hilltop youth? Who is their spiritual leader? Is this mainly American Israelis who are settlers? What has been done to crack down on them? What sorts of violence and tactics do they use? I mean, I think you did address some of that already, but please expand.
Sure. So first, I'd recommend looking up Hilltop, the term Hilltop Youth, and then Times of Israel topic, and you'll see a bunch of stories that some of my colleagues and I've been writing over the past few years, because I don't think I'll be able to get to too much now. But I would say they don't have one specific spiritual leader. Again, I think there's this debate between the Hilltop youth themselves and much of the public, or definitely the security forces, who see it as an issue of dropout of at-risk youth who are not getting the support they have at their homes or their schools, and they're finding themselves, instead of hanging out in what's called Crack Square in Kikar Chatulot in Jerusalem, they're hanging out in the hilltops and maybe they're not using drugs, but they're doing and they are, some of them, in these random hilltops in the West Bank. And I think those who see it as this educational problem see the response that's necessary as an educational one. It's not about arresting them. It's about putting them in programs that can get them to take that high school matriculation exam, that can get them back on their track of going to school or getting a job, as opposed to being out there. Now, on the other hand, there are very much those in the settlement world and national religious space that say this is not about kids that don't know what they're doing. It's a real ideology of they're the salt of the earth, that these settlements often start, very few of them, but some of them started this way of just a couple lawless youth on a hilltop creating a few makeshift homes in the middle of a Palestinian swath of land that eventually blooms into this larger settlement or outpost. And that's how we are able to create the communities that we're seeing today. And that if not for these people, we wouldn't have them. Obviously, they don't necessarily condone the violence, but I think there's still a recognition that it's part of it, or at least the fear tactic of it, that there could be violence. So I think there's this debate of whether it's an educational problem or it's an ideological one. That's the reason that we're able to bring security to families from all across Israel by having them be present there.
A related question comes from Richard Robbins, who wants you to elaborate a little bit on the efforts to address the problem of these teens who are dropouts and troubled, and giving them a future. You did talk about in Beit Alpha, the school that is there to try to give them an education, help them pass the Bagrut, but he's wondering, he said you mentioned schools that lack funding, and are there other efforts in this direction? And is that a possible way for at least a possible governmental response? I mean, the Ministry of Education, has the power to do more for these young people if it were to choose to do so.
Yeah, so the funding issue came up because the past 3 years when the country didn't have a budget. So they're basically working on the budget of previous years. So when they see a problem, they can't really address it because they're only going on what they already have in terms of funding. So when this was seen as a possible solution to addressing the phenomenon of Hilltop youth, they didn't have necessarily the funding to expand it, or even there were one or two that closed down because of lack of funding. Now, this isn't a magic solution, and there have been criticism of these institutions that they're kind of also not playing. They're all playing a role. They're giving these kids a place to stay at night, and then they're going off in the middle of the night to carry out these attacks. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's clearly been one that the authorities feel is proven effective, and it does have pretty broad support in theory from across the political spectrum. But a lot of the funding for it came out of what's called coalition funds. which is a kind of controversial phenomenon where basically each party in the government gets a certain amount of extra funds to dish out to whatever they want to dish out to. When Bezalel Smotrich and at that point, it was, I think, the Jewish Home Party was in the government, part of their funds that they wanted to use went to these kinds of programs. Now there's nobody really in the government that's their priority of where they want to send the money to, for good or for bad. And I think that's kind of where we might lack some of the funding. But again, now they passed a budget. It's possible that they have more money to spend on these issues. I would recommend reading the story about the Beit El school that is trying to tackle the issue.
I think you meant Beit Alpha, right?
Beit El.
Okay. Oh, it's Beit El. I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
misheard you. I thought you said Beit Alpha. Sorry. Okay. One more question on the Hilltop youth from our audience. Don't a lot of the Hilltop youth at least claim to be followers of Rav Kook and Rabbi Nachman as spiritual leaders?
They might look at both of them. I mean, definitely the Douma attack in 2014, where the three parents and a young child, toddler, were burned to death in an attack. The Dawabsha family, another one was severely injured. One of the alleged perpetrators, or actually no, the perpetrator was convicted, did in the recent months before very much become a part of the Breslov community, actually in Jerusalem at the time, and was spending some time in the Hilltop youth, or in the hilltops of the West Bank. For Rav Kook, I think the broader settlement movement definitely sees him as this key figure, but definitely not a top one for some of these settler youth. I think Rabbi Grossman, who was involved in Yitzhar, wrote some very extremist texts about the Israeli Jewish connection to the land and what's necessary to do in order to expand Jewish presence. I think is a bigger figure for some of these folks. But then there are some that say that it's not about ideology. So,
okay. We have another question. We saw last May that events in one sphere of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can affect other spheres. Do you see a scenario in which extremist violence in the West Bank could spark a larger scale Israeli-Palestinian confrontation? And what might that look like?
Yes, less likely. I think what we've seen in the past is that the galvanizing symbol or incident has been surrounding Jerusalem. That's a much more successful unifier for Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Israel proper to circle around than something like settler violence. But of course, an attack like what we saw with Douma or the Mohammed Abu Khder attack, also around that time, that those have just as much capacity of sparking immense violence. If the way that they're covered, I mean, if it's filmed, those things obviously play a role. But I do think that it's less likely given that it's harder to galvanize around as opposed to Jerusalem.
Okay. Evelyn Kenvin has a question. Hi, Evelyn. How, if at all, is the Biden administration reacting to Palestinian violence on the West Bank?
I think somewhat similar to settler violence. They're issuing condemnations. There was an attack in the old city of Jerusalem where a Palestinian, I think a Hamas militant, shot and killed a young tour guide at what's called the Arab Shuk in East Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem, and the U.S. was quick to issue a condemnation of that, and they have in each of their statements talked about condemning unilateral actions from both sides that push the sides away from reaching a solution. When they're talking about Israel, they say settlements and outposts and evictions and that sort of thing. And with Palestinians, they include incitement to violence and payments to prisoners who have committed acts of terror against Israelis, and just broader violence in general. So it's all part of the talking points that they use to express their concern. Going beyond that, I think they're encouraging Israelis and Palestinians to continue meeting. The Biden administration played a role in the recent Gantz meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. The more that those conversations happen, I think obviously better for everyone, and the Biden administration can play a role in that. And because when the sides get closer together, I think it's obviously there's more room for growth and dialogue.
Jean Goldstein Plesser asks, do you think it's politically relevant in Israel or the US when folks with American citizenship are among those who are injured in these settler attacks?
Hi, Jean. I think it's more likely to make headlines in the US. I think that's what we saw with this story of the 78-year-old Omar Assad, who was killed or was found dead after some sort of raid in the Palestinian village of Jaljulia a couple weeks ago. He turned out to be a U.S. citizen, and we saw some. The U.S. was quick to issue a statement demanding clarification and an investigation into the incident, and quite a few. I think that the Times, the Post, the Guardian, all these various major publications have covered not just once but multiple times this story. So it's definitely more resonance in the U.S. When these sorts of things are involving U.S. citizens. Does it resonate in Israel? I don't think so, but definitely here.
Okay. Barry Fleischman asks, has the lack of success by the PA and IDF in limiting these attacks impacted the PA's authority? And is this another threat to Abu Mazen?
I would say that when these attacks happen shortly after Abu Mazen meets with, or Hussein al-Sheikh meets with an Israeli official, they take a major hit in public opinion because they're seen as, why are you meeting with these folks when you're promising change and nothing's happening? And that's why we're also seeing some of these announcements about the naturalizing of citizens and announcing that new Palestinian IDs are very strategic in when they're announcing them, when they know that there's something else unpopular going on. Does it delegitimize them further? I think they already are seen with such a low light in the Palestinian street that I don't know if one incident or another is going to make a big difference.
Another question, do you anticipate, Jacob, that there would be a change in the government's response towards this violence if the transition to Lapid becoming prime minister is successful?
No, I mean, instead of the foreign minister being the one to condemn this, you'll see the prime minister being the one to condemn it. Bennett will become interior minister if this government holds. And I think we'll see a similar approach from his office that has little to do with this issue, but I don't see a major change in how this issue is handled because Gantz has talked about it's under his purview and that's going to continue to be the case if Lapid is prime minister as well.
We have another question from Shlomi Peril, but it's a good one. What about the Bedouin? Aren't they also under attack on the West Bank?
There are various Bedouin communities throughout the West Bank. The one that comes to mind is Khan al-Ahmar, which is this hamlet, also illegal under Israeli law, that's kind of near Ma'aleh Adumim or Kfar Adumim specifically, in the middle of the West Bank. There haven't really been incidents of violence there that come to mind where it's like this. I think there have been incidents of violence in terms of Israeli soldiers cracking down on protests there, but of settler violence, not specifically. I don't think that the Bedouin are a unique target compared to other communities. Obviously, they're more exposed because they don't have the same infrastructure. But the issue of Bedouin, I think, is much more prevalent, and that story that story is much more prevalent within the Green Line in the Negev and what we've been seeing there in terms of planting on land that they deem as theirs, and how that has played out in the Israeli political discourse and how it's kind of caused this coalition crisis a couple of weeks ago.
We have a question from Paul Colbert. Does the Israeli government have any idea or concern for how difficult the settler attacks, when ignored by the government, make advocacy here in the US so much more difficult and perhaps even ineffective when trying to reach out to younger Americans?
I think there is some recognition, but there's also a bit of frustration over why this issue has become like the main one for those focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as opposed to much more deadly attacks. That's kind of, I think, the understanding among many, on the right for sure. Among the center, I think there's a growing understanding that this is a problem, or just in general, the paralysis of the conflict is a problem, and that the fact that they have to actually address it head on, as opposed to talking about other kind of more classic Hasbara talking points. So that's a change that we're seeing in this government, and some of the diplomats that are being appointed to represent the government. I'd recommend checking out Asaf Zamir. Spoke with me about a couple months ago, and seeing his approach. He's the new consul general in New York, a former minister of tourism, and how he sees things, and he kind of addressed that issue in the interview.
Okay, we'll check it out. One or two more questions. To what extent does Israel's inaction in the face of settler violence weaken its authority in the West Bank?
Not very much.
Okay. So last question, just to sort of sum up in the couple of minutes we have remaining. I mean, basically what first of all, thank you, Jacob. You really kind of laid it out for us very thoroughly. It's not a very encouraging picture that you described, and not that we're asking you to be encouraging, just realistic and informative, but you've got these acts of settler violence that are on the increase. You've got IDF police that are either unwilling or unable to effectively respond. You have a government that, other than some pronouncements from left of center officials in the government, doesn't really seem to be taking this seriously. And I guess I would just ask, not to have a crystal ball in front of you, but where do you see this going, even in the short term?
Again, I want to stress the point that we have seen relatively significant improvement, because rhetoric is not nothing on this issue, which I've talked about. What I will say is that I think oftentimes it's taken the most horrific incidents on both sides to kind of rile up people and move them to action. And I think when you speak to folks in the Shin Bet or the security establishment, that's their greatest fear of another Douma, another deadly firebombing attack that kind of wakes up the security establishment or the police or those that are supposed to deal with these issues a little bit more to. And then there's this rash to take down the attackers, but beyond that, I mean, the question will be if it's a rooted problem that they are able to really get to the bottom of it.
Well, this has been a sobering discussion, Jacob, but a very educational one. So really, thank you for your time and for joining us today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this particular video briefing. Once again, I want to thank our supporters who are with us on today's call. Your generosity makes programs like this one possible. Again, if you have not yet done so, please consider making a contribution today at israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of our website. As always, I also encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Koplo column in your email inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding our next video briefing. Until then, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you soon. And Jacob, thank you very much. Erev Tov.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.